This is College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College.
Hello, everybody. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Just fine. The reason why I invited you for this episode of College Talk is because recently there was here at Baruch College a meeting, symposium, whatever you want to call it, about Jewish theater. And I became really intrigued about that because that's the kind of things that you hear, but you not necessarily know exactly what you mean by that. And I learned about that, and I wanted to share with our audience the kind of things that Jewish theater is all about. So Debra Caplan, she is a native of North Wales in Pennsylvania, nearby Philadelphia. She received her bachelor's degree in Jewish Studies and Theater from Hampshire College, which is in Amherst, Massachusetts, a very nice college, and her doctorate in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from Harvard University. Today, she's an assistant professor in the Department of Fine and Performing Arts, so she teaches theater, and at the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College, City University of New York. So welcome to College Talk, Dr. Caplan.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Okay. This may sound like too obvious of a question, but why do you choose to study Jewish theater? Why that specific interest?
Well, I would say that it chose me in some ways more than I chose it. So I grew up in a family where Yiddish was spoken around me quite a bit. I grew up surrounded by Yiddish culture and Jewish culture. But I did not grow up speaking Yiddish, so it was something that surrounded me that was sort of mysterious that I didn't know very much about. And I was always interested in the performing arts. I was interested in theater and music from a very young age, and I studied theater in high school and in college, and became very, very interested in theater history. And in particular, I became really interested in the history of avant-garde theater and avant-garde directing. I myself am also a director, so I was interested both from a historical perspective and also from a practical perspective as a working director trying to understand what had come before. So I went to college at Hampshire College, and my first semester, my dorm room overlooked the Yiddish Book Center, which is also in Amherst, on the campus of Hampshire College. Mm-hmm. And I was looking for a work-study job, and I walked over and, I inquired if they were looking for somebody. They hired me to sort and shelve books, and I became intrigued by the mystery, again, of something that had surrounded me my entire childhood, but I didn't really understand very well. And I signed up for a class to learn Yiddish. And the rest was sort of history. I became really, as you say in Yiddish, verchapt, like taken with this subject. And I started reading a lot in Yiddish. And when I discovered that Yiddish had this incredibly rich modernist theater tradition that had not been extensively written about, that was sort of it for me. It set me on a path.
Now, from what I have read about Jewish theater, most people will think, okay, so it's probably a comedy because, the jokes, the Jewish jokes and all that kind of things. But the fact of the matter is that there's a tremendous diversity of genre with the Jewish theater. Can you explain that to our audience, please?
Absolutely. And to add to this, I will say that when I tell people that I study Yiddish theater or Yiddish culture, people will often say, "Oh, have you heard that joke?" And that's actually not what I study. There's a lot of misconception about what Yiddish culture was and what Yiddish culture is. Mm-hmm. Yiddish culture was and is an incredibly rich compendium of Jewish literature and Jewish theater and Jewish music on a very, very sophisticated level. And what's actually really tragic is that the jokes have remained, but that cultural knowledge has vanished, and vanished in large part after the Holocaust. So there's a tragedy in that kind of cultural loss that people don't even know. But in any case, Yiddish theater is sort of remarkable because there was no professional Jewish theater anywhere in the world until 1876, which if you're thinking about European theater traditions, it's very late.
It's very
French
recent,
theater,
yeah.
German theater.
Yeah.
So, all of the sudden, these professional companies burst onto the scene in the 1870s. And there's never been theater for this community before. And people are so taken with it that it's a tremendous explosion of theatrical energy. So you go in the 1870s from having the very first kind of scrappy upstart companies forming to in the 1920s and 30s, people who don't know Yiddish, major critics from the New York Times going downtown to the Lower East Side and saying, this is where innovation is. This is where the avant-garde is going. We all need to learn from these performers. So in the space of just a few decades, there's this explosion that happens, and it explodes in all directions. There are comedies and light fare and all of that stuff, but there's also some really important, serious work.
Now, why that explosion? What made that to suddenly come to the stage, like saying, now we have all these different movement going on?
I think there's a couple of reasons. So one is that theater was pretty strictly forbidden from a religious standpoint in Jewish communities until the 1870s. And it's not so much that the rules changed, it's that people stopped paying attention to the rules. But when you have a community that has never had the opportunity to be a part of theater before, and suddenly it becomes popular, people just got into it in a very, very big and deep way. Mm-hmm. But I think there's another piece too, which is that Jews, especially in this period, were an incredibly nomadic people. Between the 1870s and the 1930s, there were mass migrations of millions and millions of Jews, and who didn't have anything that really felt like home, didn't have a country where they could go to where everybody spoke the same language or knew the same cultural references. The theater became that place. Theater is live. It happens in a space. It's different than reading a book, which you can do on your own. It doesn't have that social component, but theater does. And theater requires the creation of a temporary community and a kind of temporary home where everybody speaks your language and everybody has the same points of cultural reference. So in some ways, the theater became the proxy for the nation that Jews didn't have in this moment of like mass dispersal.
That's interesting that you mentioned that, because that reminds me, I don't know if you remember the movie The Godfather Part 2, where this is Italian theater going on in there with themes. But I think that was a common experience for many of the immigrant communities coming here, that they have their own theater, their own music. And I guess that's exactly what happened with Yiddish theater.
Absolutely. The case of Yiddish theater, what makes it different is that same thing is happening in other places all over the world. It's happening in Odessa the same way it's happening in London or New York, because the Jewish community isn't immigrating from one place where they have a home to another where they don't, and they miss the home that they had. This was, people who were being persecuted, who were largely migrating from that, but who could not go back, who never really belonged in the place that they came from. And so as they migrated, the little migrations and the big migrations all had that same valence of searching for home. But certainly in New York, this was a huge part of the immigrant theater scene, and these theaters were very close together, the Italian theaters and the Jewish theaters and the Irish theaters and the German theaters. And there was a lot of people moving between those spaces, especially in vaudeville.
Now, initially it was called Yiddish theater. Now the term Jewish theater is more common. Is that because Yiddish is being used less and less as a means of communication, or something else?
So this is an interesting question, because the word Yiddish in Yiddish means Jewish. So if I showed you, any book about Yiddish theater, is it about Yiddish theater, that is theater in the Yiddish language? Is it about all Jewish theater? Does it include theater in English, theater in Hebrew, theater in Ladino, theater in German made by Jews? It's not clear. It's all contextual. And so the terms were synonymous in Yiddish. But there's certainly significantly less Yiddish theater being produced today than there was, say, in the 1920s.
So it's more a cultural thing than a language thing at the very end. Because you mentioned Ladino, and Ladino doesn't sound like Yiddish whatsoever. It sounds mostly like old Spanish. So I guess it had to do with the culture of the Jewish community more than the language itself.
Well, it's complicated because in 1939 there were 11 million Yiddish-speaking Jews in the world, which is the largest number of Jews speaking pretty much any language ever. This was a really incredibly dominant, linguistically steeped culture, and Jews could kind of travel, many, many places around the world and find people who spoke the same language. That's, if anything, that's English now, but it's not because it's a Jewish language, it's because of globalization. Mm-hmm. So that dynamic where the language became the marker of identity has really shifted.
Now, talking about that, and we were having a conversation before the show started. There are terms that are Yiddish terms who express very well what you're trying to say, but when you try to translate that into another language, including English, it loses some of the significance and the meaning. Is that a problem when it comes to translated Yiddish theater into, let's say, English?
Absolutely. I would say in Yiddish there are even more specific translation problems because Jews who speak Yiddish speakers have what's called component awareness. So Yiddish is a fusion language, just like English. English has Germanic components and Romance components and other components, but the average English speaker may know sort of vaguely that the French words are the ones that are more elite and the German ones are the ones that are more base, but they might not be aware that that's because of where the words come from, right? In Yiddish, you have a population that was remarkably multilingual throughout most of its history. So Yiddish-speaking Jews usually spoke 5, 6, 7, 8 other languages. So they were extremely aware of where the different components came from and would use them for very specific valence. So in Yiddish, it's very common that, a noun that you want to say, you might have 3 or 4 different words you could choose for it that come from 3 or 4 different language streams. You have your Ukrainian word and your Russian word, your Germanic word, and maybe your Hebraic word. Yeah. And they have very subtle but very different valences, and Yiddish speakers play upon those to create meaning. So how do you translate that?
Yeah.
It's hard.
Something that I found really interesting reading your CV is your interest in what is called today digital humanities. And there was a particular title of one of your articles called The Case for Big Data in Theater History, which really surprised me because when you talk about big data, you're talking about something that's very quantitative, that's being produced out there, that needs to be analyzed. So tell us about what do you mean by big data in theater history?
Sure. The argument that I make in this article is that theater history sources, theater history archives, are chock full of data. So, for example, what is a theater program other than a repository for data from a historical perspective? We have, at Lincoln Center, at the Library of Congress, at all of these places, we have these huge numbers of theater programs and playbills preserved, and they are lists of names and what people did for a production. And what hasn't been done, what I've tried to do on a small scale, but I think people are just starting to do on a larger scale, is to take that information and to look at it as data, to look at it quantitatively, to try to figure out the meaning behind it. We know the people who were a part of different things. We know that a lot of those people knew each other. They had relationships with each other. But we could use that data set to figure out information about how networks work in theater or how they worked. You could use that to look at how people's political leanings, say in 1950s theater, influence their hireability, right, on a broad scale, not just on a personal level. So I've been collecting data from Yiddish theater programs and memoirs about personal and professional connections that people had with one another to make an argument for the influence of the theater company that I wrote my book about, the Vilna Troupe. And I wanted to document how the people in the Vilna Troupe were instrumental in training and inspiring an entire generation of Yiddish theater artists, and also how they were instrumental outside of Yiddish theater in American theater and film, in Polish theater and film, and in other fields.
Okay. Another title that I found very interesting in your resume was Death of a Salesman's Counter-Adapted Yiddish 2015 Homecoming. And the reason why I ask that is because Arthur Miller, which was the author, he was of Jewish descent.
Yes, he was.
So suddenly I see, okay, what's going on here? Maybe you can summarize that for us.
So Arthur Miller was of Jewish descent, but he, his family changed their name. Miller is not a typical Jewish name. It's the kind of name you choose if you want to hide your Jewish identity. And when Death of a Salesman premiered, there was speculation. In fact, there was speculation for 50-some years that Willy Loman was supposed to be Jewish and that the Loman family was intended to be Jewish.
Okay.
And Arthur Miller denied this for years, for decades. But in 1999, when it was re-released, he actually sort of admitted that, yes, the Lomans were really modeled on people in his family, and they were modeled on a Jewish family, and that there is something Jewish about this play. So anyway, before this, in the 50s, there was a couple, actually, of translators who translated Death of a Salesman into Yiddish and produced it. And this article looks at one of those productions, which many New York critics came to see. And the consensus among the American, non-Yiddish-speaking critics and the Yiddish-speaking critics was that there was something about the Yiddish version of the play that was more accurate, that was more realistic than the English version. So the article analyzes the Yiddish version against the English version and looks at how it tries to bring forth Miller's kind of hiding of Jewishness.
Now, it's interesting what you mentioned, because I was thinking right now, the issue of separation of gender in theater in general. I mean, we know that in Shakespeare time, women were not performing the women's role. I mean, actually, Romeo and Juliet were a couple of guys doing that. And in the Jewish tradition, you find, depending upon which side of the religion you are, more strict or less strict separation of gender. Has that been a factor when staging Yiddish theater? So
this is an interesting thing. This is actually something that I think I'm going to work on quite a bit in my next book project. But so Yiddish theater was transgressive. It was not ever really approved of by Jewish law. But it comes into being at this moment where these traditional Jewish communities are modernizing, and they're modernizing very fast. And there's a generational divide. It's the young people who are running away to join the Yiddish theater. That's who it is. And so they don't care about these norms of who should perform and who should not perform, and whether a woman's voice should be heard singing or not. It's irrelevant because they're already sort of secularized and invested in modernity as kind of a project. So women are a part of Yiddish theater troupes from the very beginning, from the 1870s. Yeah. Again, it's a late forming tradition, so women are fully integrated. And in fact, women were major engines for the formation of troupes and being impresarios in companies. And also, Yiddish dramas tend to have these really powerful roles for women, whether it be because of the moment or simply because there was a plethora of extremely talented actresses in the early days of the Yiddish theater, and people wrote parts for those actresses. You have these really remarkably powerful, female-centered plays.
Do you think that type of plays with portraying women in those roles have anything to do with the stereotypical Jewish mother, as they say, or is that actually a reflection of the actual culture?
It's a good question. So I think that, the stereotypical Jewish mother does come from the stage and come from the screen. And there are antecedents in Yiddish drama that go pretty far back. So there's a stage tradition of that for sure. There is, whether or not there are cultural elements, it's hard to say, perhaps. I mean, these things come from somewhere. Yeah. But the characters that I'm talking about that are the sort of iconic characters, some of them are mothers, but often they're young women. Often they're kind of ingenue roles, but they take a different spin. They go in a different direction. They do things that are, again, kind of transgressive for the period.
When you teach these topics to your students, and I'm sure many of them are not Jewish, how is the reception of this entire set of ideas and cultural background among them? I mean, do they see like a curiosity or something that really makes them think about transcultural issues? I mean, what's basically the reaction that you get from your students?
So it depends on where I'm teaching this. When I teach, I have a course on immigrant theater and film. Mm-hmm. And that course has a week on Yiddish theater alongside, a week on Italian American theater. And but every student in that course does their own semester-long project, and they do some interviewing and oral history. They make a website. They create and they give a guided tour of sites in New York that are important to their tradition, etc. What I've been surprised by is how often students choose to work on Yiddish theater, and why they choose to work on Yiddish theater. And I think, for a lot of students, it's a sense of how deeply integrated this tradition is into the city, and a curiosity about its place in their neighborhoods and their communities. I had a student a couple of years ago who was, a third-generation Lower East Side resident, and his grandmother had told stories of being best friends with the daughter of some Yiddish actors. And that's all he knew, but he felt like it had this place in his family history. And he was not Jewish, and this wasn't his family's history per se, but but he interviewed his grandmother, and he interviewed people in his neighborhood about their memories, and he did this really fantastic project.
One of the things that I have seen being done in many places is, for example, having a play which is basically African Americans, but then having white students playing those roles. And basically that happens a lot in many campuses, and it is kind of a tool to tell them, get yourself in the position of someone who is not like you. Mm-hmm. Does that happen in Yiddish theater, where you get some people who are not Jewish and then they play these kind of roles, and how is the reaction, or how they get transformed by that experience?
That's a fantastic question. Yes, that certainly happens. I mean, I think that it happens all throughout theater. I tell my intro to theater students that theater is like a laboratory for empathy, right? If you wanted to create more empathetic people, theater is the toolkit from my perspective for how you do that. Mm-hmm. Because theater is all about creating a lived experience that is not your own, and making it sort of feel as though it is your own, especially for the actor, especially for the method actor, but also to some extent for the audience. And so there's something I think really uniquely powerful about seeing something acted out in front of you live on a stage. And that's something that I think applies to all theater, regardless of who's performing, or I think it applies to all theater, all actors, and all audiences, and I think it's why theater is so important.
Now, the other thing that is also kind of transcultural here is some people don't realize that the Jewish community is extremely diverse. Mm-hmm. In terms of their traditions, in terms of how they do their worship, from the ultra-Orthodox types all the way to the secular ones. Do you see also different reactions among people of these different traditions when they are confronted with a tradition that is not theirs?
Absolutely. So there is not as much Yiddish theater today as there was, certainly by a long stretch, in the 1920s and 30s. New York used to have permanent Yiddish theaters that did Yiddish theater year-round, and they'd have 11 or 12 of them at the same time, permanent standing Yiddish theaters. Mm-hmm. Today there are 2 Yiddish theater companies in the city, but they don't perform every single day, right? And there are 2 of them. They're much smaller. But I think that one of the interesting things is that Yiddish is still very much spoken in this city. But the ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic communities are by and large not permissive of theater outside of the bounds of, single gender theater, maybe in a school, like as an educational exercise. But professional theater of the sort that we're accustomed to seeing on the stage in New York is not part of that culture. So there is that's not the community that's coming to see, by and large, the pieces that are being produced today. It's the more secular community.
Is there a particular piece that you would recommend to anyone who has never seen Yiddish theater to say, go to this one because in some way you can learn a lot about this kind of theater by being at that performance?
Well, right now, my top recommendation would be to see Indecent on Broadway, which is Paula Vogel's newest play. Paula Vogel, of course, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright. She wrote a play that is a homage to Yiddish theater history, and it is a love letter to a particular Yiddish play that is remarkable. And so her play gives you the story of this remarkable 1907 Yiddish play and what it did historically, but it also gives you more than that, because it gives you a sense of a bunch of characters' progression over time, a sense of how things changed over time for people living through, say, early 1900s until the 1940s and beyond.
When we're talking about this, it came to my memory something I read, that when the Broadway play, The Fiddler on the Roof, was trying to be made into a movie, a lot of students rejected it because they say it is too Jewish. But in fact became one of the biggest hits ever, not only on Broadway, but also on film. How do you interpret that?
Fiddler on the Roof's success?
Yes, success.
I think there's
beyond the Jewish community.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a remarkably universal in many ways story, at least as interpreted in Fiddler on the Roof. A little bit less so in the original stories it's based on, but it's a very universal story of what happens when a traditional community and traditional people are thrust into modernity. And that experience happened to lots of people. There's a story that people like to tell about Fiddler on the Roof, that when they brought the first production to Japan and did it in Japanese, people, the critics were saying, how could this be written by an American? It's so Japanese. How could this be written by a Jew? It's so Japanese. Because, the Japanese had actually a very similar experience of a very rapid encounter with modernity that was not gradual at all, similar to the Jewish experience, but of course different in terms of how it played out. But the feeling of generational divide, the feeling of things changing very quickly, I think these are universal questions for any community, and the questions of how do you retain communal integrity in a modern world where things are changing really fast?
Yes.
Those are still really important questions for people.
Very much so. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Caplan, for this very interesting interview. I had more questions, but we ran out of time, and that means that the conversation was very good.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And next week, we're going to have another interesting show about some of the faculty here doing very interesting things in experimental way. So I'm going to keep the question mark, what it's all about, so people really pay attention to that. So stay tuned.
This has been College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a production of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College. All rights reserved, 2017.